Jellineks species. So as we discuss Jellineks phases of alcoholism, Jelinek also developed a species whereby he stated that in his research in serving the 2,000 plus members of AA, that not every member was falling into these categories, that there were some differences, if I may say, that there were some characteristics that were just very unique, that everybody didn't fit into the boxes exactly. And so in developing the species, he identified alpha, beta, gamma, and delta, and epsilon. These 5 species have individual characteristics, groups of characteristics that are very unique in that they separate each other. In that alpha is purely psychological dependence. There's neither loss of control or an inability to abstain. And the progression in the alpha species is not inevitable. It's not inevitable. But yet there is problem drinking involved. Whereas in the beta classification species, the physiological problems may develop. There's no psychological or physiological dependence in the beta. And more likely in cultures where there is widespread drinking and inadequate diet. I'm reminded of a colleague who ended up doing some outreach work in Russia a few years back. This was probably about 10 years ago. And he was working with the adolescents from the ages of 16 to 25 out there. And what he came back and what he told me kind of reminded me of Jellineks beta classification. He says that many of the adolescents that were out there on the streets who could not afford 3 meals a day were basically drinking vodka 24/7. And they had a very poor diet, but yet they were able to scrounge around and panhandle money for their vodka. And so when we're talking about cultures where widespread drinking is involved and there's an inadequate diet, I'm reminded, and we need to pay attention to certain cultures and certain environments where it is prevalent. Homeless populations. No matter where you go, there's homeless people. And so the homeless people are barely getting by, especially those that are alcoholics. Their number one priority for that day is, where am I going to get the change or the money to go ahead and purchase that alcohol so that I end up avoiding the withdrawals. The next, which is the most prominent type in the United States, as well as most prominent in Alcoholics Anonymous, is the gamma species. Some of the characteristics that define the gamma is there's changes in tolerance and physiological changes leading to symptoms of withdrawal. Loss of control is another characteristic. Progression from psychological to physiological dependence. So within the gamma, we see that there is a progression from psychological dependence to physiological dependence. It's the most devastating in terms of physical health and social disruption. And therefore, as I said earlier, it's the most prominent in the United States. Now, the 4th species classification is delta. Delta is very similar to gamma, but the difference is that although there's psychological and physiological dependence, there is no loss of control within that species classification. The individual cannot stop without suffering withdrawals, symptoms of withdrawals. Now, the 5th and the most unique, it's kind of by itself, that's how unique it is classified as the epsilon species. This is where periodic alcoholism occurs. We know this as binging, where the individual goes on and drinks 5 or more drinks in more than one episode or one occasion within a 30-day period. In addition to the periodic alcoholism, we see that it's very unique within itself. You can have an individual that will go on and have a binge and yet for months not end up drinking at all. But when they do drink on that binge, it's very devastating. For a perfect example would be an individual that I had counseled one time, an adolescent, that ended up drinking 640 ounces in one night. And that's over 240 ounces of alcohol in one night, where he ended up having an alcohol overdose, and they had to put a charcoal line in him to excrete the alcohol. And unfortunately, this young man wasn't a daily drinker. When he drank periodically, he ended up drinking to where it harmed himself and harmed his health. Put him in a very dangerous, almost fatal position.